Our guest today is Sara Schneider, founder and CEO of The Human Journey. Welcome to the show, Sara.
Thank you, Kathy.
Yeah. We're honored to have you as our guest today.
Absolutely.
And we enjoyed very much having coffee with you this morning.
Oh, so did I.
Yeah, it's always great to get with our guests and find out what they're all about, and especially those that we've met for the first time, like yourself. And that's what kind of, piqued our interest when we talked about the human journey.
Yeah.
So, thanks, Jim.
So first, that's a good segue into tell us about your background a little bit.
Well, I have a rather disparate background. I have a background as a theater director and writer, which plays into the human journey, also as a cultural anthropologist. So I both direct groups for the sake of audiences and study groups. And thirdly, I design experiences for groups as an organizational learning consultant. And finally, it sounds perhaps like it won't go with the rest, but actually it governs the whole thing. I'm a yoga teacher part-time, and yoga philosophy is a big part of the human journey, which is an experience for families.
Cool.
Absolutely. And we hear that you have a famous student out there by the name of Bob Stellatello.
I do. Quite a promising student, actually.
Very good. Bob happens to be the Right-It homeowner that owns the Oak Park franchise.
That's right. He decided we would be both colleagues in the world of serving people in healthcare change and yoga friends.
He always said he was a flexible guy.
That's right.
So I jumped ahead of myself. I found it very interesting, the name of your company, The Human Journey.
Thank you.
Okay, and I suppose on some level, it kind of describes itself. We're all on a human journey, but what do you mean by calling your service The Human Journey?
Well, it's true. We're all on a human journey in our progress from birth to death. And the philosopher Teilhard de Chardin said, no, we're not really human beings who occasionally have a spiritual experience. We're actually spiritual beings all the time who have a human experience, right? Yeah. Right. And so what I am doing here is helping people look at their own journeys at times of healthcare crisis and looking at them as a family through a structured and facilitated 2-hour or so experience.
It's interesting because this is very timely, because there was actually a yoga instructor who was just found in Maui that she was just found this weekend. And she was on this journey and showing the healing, and her experience and having that kind of background is what kept her alive for 17 days.
That's right.
That she was missing. So it's quite timely that you brought Sara in here. Is amazing.
Mental and spiritual practices were certainly part of her survival, as well as what she knew how to do on her own in the wild, so to speak. It's true. So the way that my company uses the term, it's actually this 2-hour experience, as I mentioned. When you look at it from the outside, it's like a board game. It comes in a box. It has a board. It has decks. It has little implements like you might see in a board game. But it's not to be played by a family on its own. It actually is to be facilitated by someone who's been trained to hold the space for the family, because they're in a dicey point, challenging precipice kind of point in their own life as a family. And there are many things that conductor of the human journey does for them. So as I say, on the outside, it looks like a game, but from the inside, if you're experiencing it as a participant, it feels a little bit like a 3-act play. So hence the theater directing background. There's a rehearsal phase, and then there are 3 acts that the family goes through in order to look at their past, share what has helped to make them the adults that they are and shape their characters, and helps them think about the journey ahead as not ending if someone in their family is perhaps about to die, or have enter memory care or enter some other kind of service, but sees that as part of the whole trajectory, the natural trajectory of human life.
That is fascinating.
Thank you.
It seems like a unique blend of different kinds of fields. And so are you a therapist, or what's your background prepared you to do this?
Yeah, I sometimes I call myself a therapish, but no, I'm not a therapist at all. And I think of this as a healing experience more so than therapy. It partakes of the psychosocial elements, the spiritual elements, and cross-cultural elements as well. And so the theater background, the organizational consulting background, anthropology, and again, the underlying philosophy are all part of what makes this experience what it is. And when I should say that when I say the word spiritual, I don't mean a particular philosophy per se. This event is meant to be embracing of all spiritual backgrounds and to help the people who are participants in the experience also be more accepting of each other's variations in spirituality.
So now, at the beginning, how did this idea for the human journey kind of come to you?
Yeah, it's funny because it doesn't sound like something that would fall from the sky.
No.
As it turned out, there was a period where I had kind of 3 losses that all came in close succession.
Oh, wow.
And it was kind of a big whammy.
Mhm.
And so I started, as somebody who kind of thinks through writing and thinks through group experience, I started thinking about what kinds of narratives actually would be healing for myself. But I was thinking about it in a larger sense too. If I were to do something like a play about it, how would it actually work so that it's healing and not just somebody, I think we've all had the experience of people just kind of yapping away and telling the same story to everyone, but not seeming to derive any benefit from it. And maybe we've done the same thing in our storytelling.
Yes.
And so the listener goes away feeling like, okay, I didn't help, but I had to sit through all that. And so I was trying to think about what kind of narrative would actually be healing for the person who told it and a point of discovery for the person who heard it. And I started playing around with different kinds of narratives. And then there was a point where it started being not at all about me, but about how would a group heal. And so the process came in, it linked up with death and dying at a certain point. Interestingly, in my childhood, I'd had a contact with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross because she had taught for my mother when she was organizing courses at the university for continuing education. And so there was some talk of that in my household. And I have a feeling that's where I somehow got some of the interest. And then as I started my yoga practice, it felt like a natural concomitant to also be a hospice volunteer. And so I started doing that in the early 2000s and really got a lot from it. And it ended up being a real gift because as my mother a few years later was in need of hospice care, I knew what was going on. I knew how that worked. And I was able to be kind of a companion to her in a sort of shared realism about what was going on.
Wow.
And that was really a formative experience for me.
Oh, I can imagine.
You know what's key here, I think, is that people who usually get into your field or in an area that's helping or assisting in that field are usually based on some experience, right? It's some experience that got you and got your passion involved in it. So really what you've done is you've taken this into the human journey and gotten all those experiences to come together to help just even make that even more important in the journey, for the lack of a better word. That's amazing.
Right. Thank you. And when I tell people about it, I mean, typically what happens is people's eyes get big and they go, oh, we need that.
Right.
Because it's a systems-based approach. It's not focused on the patient or the person who needs care. It's focused on the whole family because typically families don't always act out of their best selves at a time of crisis like this.
Really?
Well, it seems like, don't you experience that? You can testify, yeah.
Yes.
So part of this is encouraging people, in part through the presence of a neutral outside party, to harness their best behavior and to think about how to welcome each other in that. And so what I'm doing is training organizations so that their staff, and if they have skilled volunteers who have some experience with facilitating groups, that all of those people can then go out and build capacity to do this work with families.
So you're, it's kind of like you're teaching people how to fish, teaching
That's right.
people how to facilitate.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's not a train the trainer exactly, it's train the facilitator. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like that.
And they need help in these dynamics.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Because not only do people have trouble listening themselves, but how would you teach listening to someone else?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were, if we have any support group facilitators out there, is this something that could be adapted to you mentioned families,
Absolutely.
but a support group could kind of go that same
Absolutely.
way?
Any close-knit group could do it. It doesn't have to be families. I mean, many people have a close-knit group of fellow support people or close friends or neighbors who have been helping to take care of them or are key in their life. Anybody with whom you share some intimate history would be the group.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I could see a real good fit there for that, because I've been in a support group where, it seemed like that everyone each month get together would repeat the same, and it seemed like we're not going forward. We're just kind of retreading.
That's right.
And it's not sure that we were moving forward.
Yeah,
Well,
so
that's right. And I think that's a typical problem of groups themselves, is that they don't know how to get themselves out of the grooves that they've traced so heavily. How do you take them forward? And then what the conductor is doing is facilitating them in a movement forward that's choreographed and structured around group process and how group process works.
Oh, that's so nice.
So now, where would I will say a family and a facilitator meet? What type of settings?
Well, it would largely be in homes, or it could also be in a nursing home, for example, or memory care facility. The human journey was originally designed for the hospice setting, but as I mentioned earlier, it's not exclusive to that. And so when staff go out to families' homes, it could even happen in a home health setting or home care setting. They would go out and they would ask somebody, it's typically the matriarch in the family who makes the decision to go forward or not, and then gathers everybody else together and invites them to take part in this. And typically you have people who are resistant. They don't want to talk feelings with each other.
Oh, no.
And so the experience is designed for all kinds of safety measures for those who are afraid to get into this kind of thing, including ways to leave at the intermission, so to speak, right, between the acts, without disrupting anyone else who's participating. All kinds of ways to do that, assuming that some people are just not going to be that comfortable, but everyone else can have a good experience.
So,
well thought out.
Yeah. So it's like past baggage in the group. Could that be like a sabotager of progress?
It could. So you would want to do a little bit of assessment in advance to see if there are big family secrets or, addiction stories or abuse stories like this. This would not be appropriate for that. You actually really want a therapist working with that.
That's good to learn.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that.
And so is there anything else like this already being done?
No, there isn't. And it's very interesting. I mean, hospice, for example, was the concept of it was brought forward in order to deliver integrative care. But as more efficiencies build in the hospice world, there's a little bit more siloization happening between the nursing side, which tends to predominate, the social work side, the chaplaincy side. The volunteers maybe aren't used for skillful work as they're capable of delivering. And this service can actually be presented by anyone in any of those categories if they have the group facilitation chops, so to speak. So it could happen there.
So let's just say I'm a person and I have maybe a cancer diagnosis or whatnot, and and a social worker or chaplain comes to me and says, I'd like to give you a chance, you and your family, a chance to participate in the human journey. How would that work? How many people would participate? And what if a person doesn't have a family?
That's right. Yeah. So it usually works the best with up to 6 people.
6.
Up to 6. It can be done with up to 8. But it will take longer.
Oh, okay.
And I find too that people who are not related tend to take longer than people who are related, have that much of a shared history.
Oh, okay.
So you kind of have to put those factors into mind. So they don't have to be related at all. I go back to the era of the AIDS crisis. and was living in New York at the time. And so I have a lot of experience with people who were dying with the help of friends or who needed care with the help of friends around them. And there were care schedules. And we have a lot of people like that who are sick and they're alone.
They sure are.
So it could also be participated in by a caring person, a caregiver, and a neighbor or an in-law or whoever the group happens to be. But a staff member could also take part in addition to the conductor. And that way someone has a group around them helping them to voice what's important to them.
So it could be a group that's kind of circumstances have brought together.
That's right.
Not by birth.
That's right. And I should mention too, when you were asking Jeanette about the, does anything like this exist? There are tools that help families air what their wishes are going to be very specifically about, say, advanced directives and things like this. But there isn't a tool that predates that helps families get on the same page to attune to each other in terms of values, to hear what each other's values and perspectives are, the kinds of things that are actually necessary to make medical decisions. And we kind of assume people already have that.
And that's a huge assumption.
That's a huge incorrect assumption.
Incorrect,
Yeah.
because nobody knows, and I just shared the story, over coffee. We lost my mother-in-law, and we've been in the business, and we didn't know as a family.
Exactly.
I mean, we could have used some help in making some of these decisions.
That's right. And so interestingly, the human journey does never mentions sickness or dying per se. Typically, the person who is in that position brings it up. And so people seek in the experience their own level of depth. And once the person who is sick or dying or in a kind of or is disabled, has something going on, brings it up, the others tend to dive with them. But it also has that kind of flexibility to be used in almost any of these situations where you have an individual whose status has changed and the family needs to come around them. That's really the essential piece of it.
So whose status has changed. So if a one, not to go too in the weeds, but if it was like one family member, I'm bad about going to the weeds, got divorced or whatnot,
Right.
would that be
Sure.
could be a journey?
Yes, it could be something around. I mean, some people get divorced very amicably,
and some don't.
and some don't. So you could do one where you're surrounded by, a person who is the leaving spouse or whatever. Could be surrounded by their people, or the person who is the trailing spouse, as they call them. Could be surrounded as well.
Cool.
They could both be. Well, I mean, and the other thing is, it doesn't put the focus on the patient or the one person. Unlike many other services, like the ones where they have to specify advanced directive, it makes them an equal participant, which is often a relief for that person, not to be the focus all the time.
Oh yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you used the word conductor.
Yeah.
And I'm starting to really see why. In fact, I like to use the word orchestrator.
Yes.
Why is that person needed?
This person does several different functions, and in the training that I offer, we do about 8 different functions that the conductor serves. One of them is to model good behavior for the family. And so they actually model some of the skills, the perspective taking, the listening skills that people are asked to reproduce in the experience itself. Another is to kind of hold the ground rules of the experience. There are ground rules. And so the people who are more dominant in the family system really don't get a chance to do that. And they also don't have to do that. They don't have to play their typical family roles. The ground rules keep everyone on that even field.
Oh, that's important.
That's important. The other thing is, and in the theater world, there's kind of a different perspective between the actor and the director. The actor has to do the research on the character and constantly take the character's point of view in mind. The director keeps the big picture of how the characters are interplaying, like the orchestrating you were talking about, Jim, the orchestrating back and forth. And that's what this conductor is doing too, like an orchestra conductor, is kind of bringing people in as they need to be brought in.
So you have to kind of call an audible kind of as you go
That's
along.
right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And so how does somebody become the conductor for the human journey?
Well, an organization like a memory care facility or a nursing home or a hospice or a hospital with a palliative care practice will say, I'd like to train, say, 30 people. Could be all staff, could be their field nurses if they have the freedom to spend this kind of time with patients, could be their chaplaincy staff, could be a mix. Ideally, it's a mix of people across disciplines. Social work particularly, bereavement. And then I'm really keen on volunteers also doing this because they serve as ambassadors for the organization as well. And many of them have been through a loss of a family member in a situation like this. They really have.
Yep.
Well, like your own experience.
Precisely.
Which drew you to this.
Precisely.
Okay.
Yeah, and so they're operating from the compassion and the experience that they've already had. And so the training is 2 days, it's 14 hours. And so it can be done over a weekend, a Friday night to a Sunday morning,
Okay.
or it could be done over a couple of weekdays, which is often better for people. And the people actually practice facilitating the 3 acts, the rehearsal period. There's a debrief of all of that. There's experiential exercises around the skills they have to teach. And then there's also training on how to shape the experience to the needs of the family situation, because sometimes a family doesn't have 2 hours. And you still want to give them a successful experience that bonds the family together, gives them ultimately a greater sense of belonging to weather the changes that are ahead. And also kind of a deeper sense of meaning, particularly if it's a parent who might be in tough straits, a deeper sense of meaning for the middle-aged or kids of that parent who are maybe struggling with existential issues.
I like the I like the symbolism of the boots.
Oh, thank you.
You know, it's like this is going to get dirty, or this just might get dirty, but let's all put on our all different backgrounds, all different sizes, all different people coming to the table here, and let's take this journey together.
That's neat.
It's like such a great thing. Yeah.
By the way, I'm showing that on Facebook right now.
Oh,
With
yeah.
yeah.
If you're listening on the radio, it's a series of like empty, dirty rubber boots
Uh-huh.
by the doorway, and they mean a lot of different things to different people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's just sort of like, okay, everybody is home. Sometimes they're empty boots when we get home.
Yeah.
Sure.
Also,
That's another
yeah.
one. Mhm.
Sure. And it sounds like you're addressing all of these.
Yeah, it's 360.
Yeah.
And as a designer of group experiences, that's what I really like, is to design for people with disparate places in the diagram, so to speak, or different disparate places in a given experience, all getting what they needed from the experience.
I'm putting it up on our Facebook page right now, folks. So if you've been listening intently, as I have, for the first time, if anybody's ever noticed on our Facebook page, I literally was just sitting back in my chair and I'm just like,
This is amazing, isn't it? Yeah, very amazing.
so I'm going to put that post up for you.
Thank you.
So without giving away too much, like what's 2 or 3 things that would come up in a typical, if that could be put into words?
In a typical, working with families?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Early in the rehearsal process, there is kind of a physical act of pawing through cards. They're not just handed out, but I actually want them getting in the dirt, like you were saying about the dirty boots.
Yeah.
I actually want them pawing through the cards and bumping up against each other as they start to identify some of the conditions that made them who they are. The conditions they were born into, that they had no human responsibility for, that this was just what they dropped from wherever people are before they're born, dropped into. It becomes quite a nice experience of them jostling each other, kidding each other, and that physicality actually serves them really well later. The other thing is that there are physical opportunities all the way through the experience. Some of it, they're asked to tell something, to recall something, but some of the experiences are not telling or verbal even at all. Some of what they're asked to do is simply remember and breathe. Sometimes they're asked to show a facial expression that they had at a certain time, or to show how they stood at a particular time. And those have tended to be very powerful for the people watching.
And I can imagine that.
Yeah.
I can imagine that. And so the thing I would like our audience know is how. Okay, so you train the trainer, okay, or the facilitator,
yeah.
or for orchestra.
Yeah.
How does somebody find, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead, how does somebody find, if a family listening today should need somebody to help this, how do they find a facilitator?
Well, they because it's licensed strictly to organizations right now, not to individual practitioners, they can call me if they would like to.
Great.
So I'm at, shall I give a phone number?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, this is a good appropriate time.
Okay. So for me, the number is 312-593-2345. And email is Sara, Sara, at thehumanjourney.com. And the human journey all have hyphens between the words.
Hyphens. Okay.
And so you would be able to tell an individual, an organization that has this program, and
That's
somehow
right.
they would be able to participate in it.
That's right.
Okay.
Excellent. Excellent. So could you, what would be like some of the feedback you get after a family goes through, like the rough, you mentioned a rough time. What have they come back and
One
said?
thing they say is that wasn't so bad. These are typically the people who really had to be, pushed into it by the matriarch. Another thing that happens is that other people will take me aside and say, I was astounded by what so-and-so was able to share.
Oh.
Because typically it's been a vehicle for people who needed the structure to be able to talk. They needed the outside person to be able to open up,
To pull it out.
to pull it out, or just to give the structure. They did it very willingly, but there needed to be the outside person there. And I've seen that quite invariably.
That number one more time. If
Oh,
someone
sure.
wants to call you.
312-593-2345.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sarah.
It's been a joy.